our next panelist round will be on the speed and performance of web pages and user experience enhancement. So we have our panelist, Anders Lindstrom, Director of Marketing, Sygnature Discovery. So Anders is the Director of Marketing at the leading drug discovery firm, Sygnature Discovery, having worked in and around marketing for 19 years. And he's passionate digital citizen with a track record of growing business of all sizes. And we also have Mr. Charles Demarkles. Hi, Anders. So Charles spent over a decade working in the digital optimization and analytical industry. He founded Demarkles Digital, a full-service digital agency. After leaving PayPal's global web and global MarTech teams, at PayPal he was in charge of global technical SEO and building custom internal platform health and analytics too. He's digital optimization and analytics principal of Demarkles Digital. Welcome you both.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
So Charles, while you get the slides up, should I just do, we've already been introduced obviously, but I think just to kick us off, like was already mentioned, I'm Anders Lindstrom, Director of Marketing at Sygnature Discovery. We work in drug discovery and serve biotechs and pharmaceuticals. I'm a generalist digital citizen and a generalist marketeer leading a team. I've got an interest in web performance and speed, and I will put my hand up and say I'm also an offender. I don't practice entirely what I preach in this, and I have a lot to pick up on. It's a lot on my to-do list actually, but I approach it from a slightly different way. So I think in short, before I hand over to Charles, what I would say is that if you have any questions that are of any technical useful nature, Charles, you're a man. If you want a shoulders to cry on when it comes to web performance and speed, hey, come to me. Charles, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Andy. Yes, so today, like they just mentioned, we're going to discuss web page speed and latency. And, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people tend to ignore when they're working on their websites. And it's really unfortunate to see, because ultimately it sort of is like having the foundation of a house that you're going to build. The stronger the foundation, the better the house you can put up, right? So with that, we're going to dive into what we have going on for latency.
And I just thought it'd be useful to zoom out and think, what is it? What's the purpose of it? What is it that we're actually looking for? And I think it's easy to get too blinkered, and just when you focus on speed and web performance, what you really have to think of is zoom out and think of what will work for my target audience, what is important to them and what matters to them. So instead of just ticking boxes like crazy, I was going to say make your target audience click, but I went with tick instead. And I would say that having the right kind of content is still of utmost importance. So don't forget about that. That comes first. I would say it's better to have a website that serves the right content, that helps or serves the right thing for your target audience. It's more important. It's better to have that with a website that loads in 10 seconds than have something that is completely wrong and loads in 2 seconds. The other thing I would say is that it doesn't stop there. It's not just the user experience. You have to think of it in a slightly wider sense. I think having something that is a seamless experience and speed is definitely a part of that, but also you should never, your target audience or your users should never have to stop and think, what do I have to do next? What is happening here? Why is this taking so long? There was a book written, I think about 18 years ago now, so it's a long time ago, but it was a chap called Steve Krug, who's a bit of a user experience guru. And the title of the book says it all. It's Don't Make Me Think. So again, the users should only have to focus on what information they're trying to get, or what they're trying to buy from your website, or any other exchange interaction they're looking for. They shouldn't have to stop and figure out what's going to happen next, or what they have to do next. And they shouldn't also be met with latency, which Charles is going to talk more about, to make them wonder, is this actually working? Is this website performing? Is it working at all? But if we look at speed and performance specifically, again, in my head, there are two categories that we're trying to please here. You got the humans, so your actual users, and I think they're number one. They're the most important ones. But then you've also got the bots, so the search engines and the bots they send out. And I think from a user experience point of view, we're so impatient nowadays, and we're so used to instant stimulus. And when we don't get that stimulus, something is triggered in our brains that makes us move on and search for that immediate result somewhere else. So I think a really good comparison or benchmark, if you're wondering how well am I actually doing here, in addition to the Lighthouse and Web Performance Insights, etc., that Charles is going to point to in a bit, I think is comparing to who your main competitors are and how are you performing and how is your website performing compared to them is a good benchmark. But like I said, I think as users of digital media, we're driven by our subconscious here. When we're on a screen, we're so impatient. If I compare it to when I'm on the phone with a call center, so if I phone up a provider of some sort, company, and if they tell me on the phone that, yeah, you can get what you're after, or you can do what it is that you come to do if you just wait 10 seconds, I would probably say, yeah, okay, yeah, I can wait 10 seconds. Somehow on screen, that kind of patience doesn't exist. So it's key to get it right. And there are varying stats for how many people leave a website after what time. I think there's one banded around which is 40% leave if it doesn't load within 3 seconds. So it's absolutely key to get right. And if they leave, they go somewhere else. So this, if you are a for-profit company, for instance, like we are, that at the end of the day is lost revenue. And there are several metrics and sort of things you can put into place to actually quantify how much it is that you lose from that. So I think it's a lot about the feel for humans. It's really about how does the web performance feel? And depending on what type of site we're talking then, how quickly can users interact with a web page? We don't always need all the content to load. We don't always need it to be a complete picture, but how soon can we interact with it? I think that's the key thing. And I think, and I know Charles is going to come back to it, cumulative layout shift, etc., or something. I'll mention it later when Charles gets to it, actually. I think the other one then is the bots. So with bots, because obviously we're looking at this also as a measure, we know it's part of search engines algorithms for how you rank in terms of organic search ranking and traffic from there. And we need to bear in mind that search engines have limited time and resources. Their bots are very busy. They have a what's called a limited crawl budget, because they've got billions of websites to check. Yeah, so each site will have a certain crawl budget, which for how much time they crawl the site. And if certain pages take too long to load and for them to crawl, then that just means that fewer pages on your website will be crawled, and hence you'll suffer from an SEO point of view with indexing, etc. So obviously the bigger your site is, the bigger the problem is. If you have a 2-page site or something like that, that's not going to be less of a problem. But so I just think, again, to summarize this slide, zoom out and think about what actually matters. Why is it that we're looking at web speed and web performance? Why does this actually matter? And yeah, over to you, Charles. I know you got a bit more of a deep dive there.
Oh, thank you, Andy. Yeah, like Andy said, the best way to approach anything in search is really to think about, you're catering to two audiences. At the end of the day, you're trying to teach the bots what your content is about, and that's where you get into, information architecture, et cetera, and making sure you have clean metadata and all sorts of other things. And then you have to think about how to treat the end user too, though, because ultimately you need that user to go and perform the actions that make you the money, right? Um, with that said, let's see here. So basically, latency can be described as almost the horsepower of your website's engine. So when you think about a car, right, and like every car comes with X amount of horsepower, and that really dictates how fast and then how much they can accelerate quickly, et cetera. And when you think about that from that perspective, that's pretty much what's going on with your website too. Like Andy had said, a lot of people go on, and if they don't get to the interaction that they're looking for right away, they move on to the next place. And these days especially, there's a lot of next places. So it's really important that your site is able to provide that fast experience. One of the things too that Google considers when you think about the ranking factor in latency, they mean for queries to be like having a conversation. So when a user says, hey, where can I go to get a pizza right now? They want it to have a fast turnaround time, just like you said it to your friend who's sitting right in front of you. So whenever you encounter something like that on one of your web properties, it's really important to address it as fast as you can. Like we said, that's going to really also impact whether or not users are going to go on and convert, right? Because no one wants to deal with a slow site. You don't want to ask someone a question and then 5 minutes later they give you the answer, right? So that's going to be one of the important things to be thinking about. Just a high-level overview, but I think it really helps you visualize what goes on when you load a web page for those who aren't familiar. Essentially, when you click on a website, right, and you make any request, your internet service provider is asked, to retrieve the data, right? And the data is going to be not just the web file, but also the IP from the DNS. And so when you consider that transaction is going on, and then when you think about how they have to respond to the client, a lot of little transactions are going on in one period of time. And when you think about it from that perspective, it really makes you understand not just how important it is to have fast web pages, but also that you have to take a deeper dive and make sure that all of your files and all the things that are working on your web page are not just providing value to the customer, but also aren't slowing down what you have. Something else too that people don't tend to think about, or it's becoming more and more popular now, is mobile browsing has changed dramatically from when I got into this industry 11 years ago. Back then, I mean, not even everyone, the iPhone was maybe kind of getting popular at that point, but not everyone had it. So when you consider now like what phones are capable of doing and how pretty much everyone's carrying at least one on them somewhere, but that the network connectivity is not always the best, it's really important to make sure that you have an answer for any query, and that answer has to be able to be provided quickly. And like something to think about there too is, when you perform a search from your office, you'll notice you might get one SERP layout, and then if you perform the same search from your elevator, you're probably going to get a different layout on the search engine results pages as well. And then similarly, once you're outside and in the parking lot, you might get a third layout. And a lot of that has to do with the end user's network connectivity and the ability for these certain websites that perform better to satisfy that query. So, like Andy was saying, we want to make sure that, we're providing users with the best possible experience. No one wants to be waiting around. The faster that people can interact with something, the faster they're going to. And if you have especially a longer conversion funnel with a lot of touch points, it's going to be important that you're able to push people through that and get as much information as you want before you lose their attention. And with that too, maybe Andy can have something to say here about conversion rate optimization. But ultimately, like I was just saying, that's really important. And if you're going to have multiple touch points without having the ability to get people through that quickly, you're not going to have a good conversion rate, right? People are going to be dropping, exiting from those poor pages. And so you're going to need to be not just checking every page on your property, but also, taking time to look at your analytics numbers too and seeing where people aren't spending time or where people are diving out, right? There might be one page in particular that has a short time on page, but maybe you only have, 50 words of content on it. And in that case, maybe you think, all right, we have to add some more content here. But if you have other pages that you notice, people are all abandoning, but they're spending a decent amount of time on in that visit, you're going to have to ask yourself at some point, is this because the page doesn't load well? Or is there something going on under the hood that maybe we didn't think about, such as a piece of rich media, etc. And when you're looking for these things too, something that's come out in the last year that's been pretty interesting, Screaming Frog is obviously my favorite tool out there in search. It just has, you can do everything with it for the most part. And they started actually letting you use API data from Lighthouse. So you can actually get that URL by URL level page speed scores, which is pretty important, especially when you are looking at your conversion rates, right? Andy, did you have anything for conversion rates?
Just in picking up on what you said there about the exit, and this is obviously data you can get. There's pretty simple data in Google Analytics that you can pick up on where people are exiting. And like you said, Charles, I think it's important that you look under the hood and see why are people exiting there. Is it because that takes too long to load, or they lose interest, or is it actually, but that's the page that happens to be useful and it serves the right content that makes them satisfied, or they fill in the form there. So that's it. So you gotta look into it. Exit data is important, but like Charles said, you've got to look under the hood and understand why that is.
Absolutely. And then, like I was saying before, right? Different mobile connectivity styles will render different search engine results pages. And I'm sure that, everyone can think back to that there's been a variety of them over the years. I mean, this one, the example on this slide here is showing the standard results, then when they started doing rich snippets, and then cards, right? And those aren't even the only things that have changed. I mean, for those of us that remember, there used to be a carousel just for accelerated mobile pages only. And that's sort of, the bribe that they gave you to make sure that you started to switch over to AMP content. Because if you did it properly and you had good enough domain authority, you would actually be able to have an AdWords listing, have your AMP listing, and then also still have the #1 position in organic search. So at that point, they might only be showing 2 of your competitors. And that's, something you have to think about, right? I equate it to like when you're playing basketball, boxing out the competition, right? Going for the rebound. But in this case, you're just trying to make sure that anytime that there's a query, not only are you visible, but also are you making sure that other people aren't visible by utilizing all of these extensions and, other things that are appearing on the SERPs. And, touching upon what I said too with the network, especially on mobile, you're going to have different search engine results pages for the same query, no matter what the difference in connectivity is more often than not, and that even goes for Wi-Fi too. But you can't really assume that every user is on Wi-Fi. And it's always important to be testing different connectivity levels on each of the pages that you test when you're actually, getting ready to launch them, and thinking about what resources are tying up more of the load time and sequence, and then figuring out how to make them better load, right? And in all circumstances. So when we're measuring latency, there's a handful of things that we're looking at, right? Obviously the actual speed that the page takes to load, the time that it actually takes to render, which is just showing something above the fold. And then also thinking about, what goes into that web page loading, like I was saying before. And something to consider there is you also have a lot of files going back and forth, right? I mean, a very well optimized page might only have, 20 or so, but, certain websites, and I'll show an example later, have hundreds of these requests going back and forth. And when you think about it, each one of those requests, no matter how many threads you have running at a time in your browser, no matter how many threads are going there, those requests still take time, right? Because essentially it's like if I asked you for a question like, hey, hand me this file. And even if you don't have it and it's redirected, that still adds time to the sequence where other things could have been loading. And then, of course, you want to take a look, too, to see how much time these requests are taking. And then, how much actually bytes of information per request are you getting transferred at once. And when you look at all those things, it becomes a lot easier to visualize how to speed up your web pages, even if you think that you have a relatively fast experience. And a lot of things you want to be looking at too that can help with this are making sure that your cache policy on your website is good and up to date, and also tag management systems. Google has some, Adobe has some. I've worked for companies where we've built our own versions as well. And those things are great because essentially what happens is, we all know we need our analytics data, right? And we all know that we want to have our Google Search Console, our Bing Search Console, and whatever other tools of choice that we have as marketers. However, all those tags also add requests. And what tag managers do, which is pretty cool, is essentially what happens when any of those analytics things are collecting information is the pixel gets fired off. And then as they do different clicks and or leave the site, a new pixel is fired. And when that happens, all it does is mentions the change in time and then change in whatever the statistics are. And so by having, if the tag manager is able to shoot off one pixel that can satisfy as many tags as you need, you can save, like I just mentioned there, at least 3 of the requests that are coming in and condense them down to 1. And in the example I'll show at the end, that would be very helpful for some sites. So we're going to actually get into, some of the more interesting stuff behind latency. More often than not, folks are just talking about the high level, but I thought it would be more beneficial for us to actually look under the hood as to what we actually do when we're examining this. So for those who aren't familiar, webpagetest.org is pretty much the best place to go for when you're looking at web page speed issues. You go in, you can put in your URL, and what's really neat about them too is that you're able to actually test on not just a 4G connection, 3G connection, a 3G slow connection, but you can also test for pages from different places around the world, not just the country. And so I oftentimes use that when I'm dealing with international sites especially, because it's a lot better to get an idea from a closer connection to where their server and hosting is going to be than to try to do it from New York City. And when you do it that way, you get a much better idea as to what the end user's experience is going to be. And then also looking at those different mobile connections, I used to work for a large international company, and one of the things we had to consider was that not every country where we had mobile traffic had the same access to good mobile internet speeds. And so we actually had to take that into consideration because some of our numbers and analytics weren't quite making sense. But then we thought about it and we're like, hey, over there, the networks aren't quite as fast as they are here. So that's something we have to consider when we're trying to make their content, right, and make it appear a lot better. We mentioned a couple metrics too that are discussed heavily in this, but another thing that we want to think about too is it's called the time to first byte. And essentially what that is, it's the time that it takes for your server to turn around and deliver the first byte of data based on the requests that it's getting. And essentially having a fast time to first byte is the first step in having a fast web page, because from there, it's a lot easier to get a lot of requests threading at once. And, at that point too, that's usually most of the hangup. I'm sure you've noticed when you go to log in somewhere and the first immediate section, it takes, a couple seconds there. That's really easy to notice, right? Whereas if you can get something rendered in that first byte of data quickly, no one has to know that you used lazy loading to load the video halfway down your page and that it wasn't sitting there waiting for them the whole time. A couple other things that we want to look at too are going to be the rendering time, which, like I mentioned, that's when something first appears on the screen and there's something to see. And then the first contentful paint, which is similar to the render time as well. It's basically just saying at this point, we finally have something that the user can look at and potentially interact with. And like I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the time that it takes for these things, the number of requests that it takes, as well as the size of the packets that are going back and forth in terms of total bytes.
And just to add on that, Charles, so what we said about in the beginning, so for humans, it's a lot about a feeling and how soon can they interact. The user experience, those are kind of the key metrics there. Whereas for search engine, Google, other search engines are available. And Charles, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but actually what the key part in Google's algorithm is time to first byte. That's the key thing, the key metrics that count, right? Yes,
because essentially, that goes back to what I was saying with, it's supposed to be like how you and I just asked a question and we got a response, right? So that first byte is at least saying hey, I'm thinking about it, maybe by saying or something, but at least there's something on there. Whereas with a blank space, it's not quite as good and helpful. So breaking down a little bit more about what comes out of a webpagetest.org test results here. As you can see, it shows on the left-hand side of the slide what the URLs that we're searching for, where we searched for from, and then also what connection we used there. In this instance, I was using the desktop cable connection that is running on Google Chrome coming out of Virginia in the USA. It'll also show you the date and time that you took the test at, which is helpful in my opinion, just because, for your record keeping. A lot of times when I'm doing these projects, actually, I'll take all the information from here and keep a record of it, take what the difference is in terms of connection types. And then also at the end of everything in the last row, or the last cell of the row rather, I'll put in the URL, because these pages, the webpage tests, they actually have unique URLs you can go back to. It's not like some of the other tools out there where every time you put it in, you're going to run a unique view and you can't necessarily retrieve the original. So that's something helpful to keep in mind as well with this. So looking here, there's 7 boxes here, and it looks a little intimidating, but it's all really helpful information. And the way that they break it down with the letter system is, in my opinion, fantastic. It just makes things so much simpler when you look at it. So the first box that we have here that says A+ in it, that's the security score. So the webpagetest.org will actually look at whatever JavaScript libraries are running on the page that you submit to them. And they'll assess what's going on, if there's any ones that have been reported recently as having any troubles or any type of security threats. They'll give you that there, which is pretty convenient, because those are some things that maybe not everyone thinks about, right? Especially folks that aren't too heavy into development. So having that there and knowing how to clean it up is pretty quick and nice to have.
I just want to say, as a PayPal customer, I'm reassured that the security score is A+.
Yeah, that is one thing that they're very good at over there, is the security. So the next box here is the rating for a page's time to first byte, like we were talking about. In this instance, it's a B, so they need to step that up. But but that's one of the more important things. So we always want to see that that's an A. I mean, and or at least see that it's not a C or below, because that's really not good from the ranking perspective, much less from the user's perspective. Keep alive enabled is the third box, and that's really just rating how much of the connection between the web page and the server, or your browser and your server, sorry, is persistent and actually moving, and that there's a fluid connection the whole time. More often than not, that's one that everyone kind of does well, but you see some exceptions once in a while. The next box is talking about the size of the packets that are being transferred with the requests, right? And you always want to make sure, whenever possible, that all of these files have been compressed as much as possible, whether that's actually using compression on something like an image through a Photoshop, etc., or even just by going into your source code of your JavaScript and CSS files and making sure that the code is minified, and then whatever is grouped together that will still work fluently is grouped together. That's going to be important for saving time, and then also for reducing the number of requests so that you have more time to load other items on the page. There's also the image compression, and that's, like we mentioned before, just making sure that all of your images are saved in the best possible formats. PNGs are for anything that doesn't have to be very high quality, and JPEGs for anything that, such as like an art site or a gallery type site. And even with that, it's always important to experiment with how much you can take the size down anyways on an image without sacrificing the quality. Like a lot of people do think that having the best quality images is, very essential to their site. And they're not wrong, but usually, or at least more often than not, I've found ways to make them smaller and more efficient. There's also some other new formats that have come out in the last couple of years called next generation formats, such as the JPEG 2000, a couple others out there. Those ones are something to certainly explore too. They're designed for better functionality, and they're going to be more compressed with more actual, ability to see things in terms of details. However, they don't work for every site. So it's going to be important to go in and test to make sure that they are the best option for you before just hopping into the trend. As you can see, that they got an F there, and that's for the caching the static content. So like we mentioned before, right, you want to have a cache policy that anytime that there's something that's not going to change on the screen in terms of when you're loading, that it sticks with a user so that repeat users get it a lot faster. And, it seems like something small, but, I'm sure you've noticed, like if you clear your browser and all of your history in cache, and then you go load a page again that you go to every day, it does take a little extra time. And the last one there is talking about using a content delivery network. And essentially a CDN is a way that if you have international audiences, or you have an audience maybe that's in one specific location that's not close to yours, there is still some lag time between geolocations, right? If you've ever taken out your command prompt on your computer and done a trace route of an IP address, you'll notice that a lot of hops take place that you didn't even notice like in addition to the hops that are taking place for loading all these requests. Like if you do one from New York, you might bounce around through New Jersey, you might end up going to Chicago, and next thing you know, you're loading something from Seattle. And those are things that you don't think about when you're actually looking at the underlying stuff that goes on when you load a web page, which is also kind of interesting to think about because, we get mad that pages are moving so slow, but in reality, a process of like 60 things might have just taken place. So looking at the next section of the page there, when you're looking through the answer and the report, so the first three parts there, the time to first byte is shown, the time when the page actually starts to render is shown, and then the first contentful paint. And like I mentioned, the page of, the render and the first contentful paint should always be very similar because essentially they're very similar, not quite the same, but they're up there. I ran this one with a page actually that had an error code just to show that if there is an error code of sorts, that'll be what that green square box is. And it'll show you there what error code it gave you. So whether or not that's a 404, or in this case, it was a 0, that'll be shown. But if you run it on a live page, they won't show you that. Next, we look at the web vitals, the next three boxes there, where we get into the largest contentful paint, the cumulative layout shift, and the total blocking time. And these are metrics that they're also taken from Google's Lighthouse. And they're very important ways to look at, in a more simplified manner, how this is actually taking place, right? The largest contentful paint is going to be when you finally have something that the user can see, and it's like a focal point on the page. So the page is mostly filled up there. The cumulative layout shift, like Andy was discussing earlier, was basically any time that the page shifts. And I'm sure you've noticed when you're loading pages, particularly on mobile, it'll come in one way for a second, and then all of a sudden something happens, and this button you went to click on the right is now in the center. And so it's measuring that because you obviously don't want that to happen. Andy was actually telling me a story yesterday. I'll let him complete it actually, because it was a good one.
No, it's just it's a real bugbear of mine too, and I think that is key, especially for the humans, so the user experience. And I don't know how many times I have effectively reacted quicker than the site or the app finishes loading, and I'm sure people will this will resonate with people. So instead of the link that you intend to click on or tap on, it shifts and you end up tapping on or clicking on something either completely irrelevant, or in many cases, and here there's a cynical part of me, I think that some sites and some apps might do this on purpose, because if they place an ad just in the right place and it just shifts that amount of pixels just at the right time, you'll end up clicking on that ad, and hence their click rates for the ads that they'll sell will go up. It's a cynical kind of theory. I call it a conspiracy theory even, but I would not be surprised if that was the case. So, but Charles, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, CLS has become a ranking factor, a signal that very recently now bots will pick up on. So it has become important, that which should help user experience in general.
Absolutely. And, it's one of those things to think about too, that, for as long as I've been doing this, 11, 12 years now, one of the main things is that Google would always not like it if you were lying to them about something. And anything you did that seemed kind of deceptive would also not go unnoticed, and you'd get penalized for it. And I think that that's sort of what they're treating this like. It's not to say it's deceptive, but at the end of the day, like Andy was just saying, if you're clicking on something and then all of a sudden what you actually click on is something else because the page shifted, that's not exactly being honest with the end user. So I think that that's part of why they're doing that, to get people to clean it up. So the last 6 boxes, the first 3 are when the document is considered complete. And at that point, it's basically saying, everything is loaded minus, the things at the very bottom list, especially if you have lazy loading implemented. And it's showing you the time it took, the number of requests, and how many bytes were transferred. But what's interesting about this page, you can tell that there must be some rich media on it, because the document was completed in 1.6 seconds, 17 requests, and 241 kilobits. And it wasn't fully loaded, though, for about 10 times that in terms of the actual bytes in that took place. 28 requests, and it took almost 6 seconds for it to load. So that's something interesting to consider when you're looking at these latency projects. And again, you want to be looking at those numbers and figuring out how do you make the most efficient use of all these requests. And obviously, the more data you try to pass in fewer requests, it might take a little bit longer per request. But at the same time, by doing that and packaging things the right way, you're able to save a lot of time in the grand scheme of things. So we're going to run through this really quickly. It's basically going through the information that comes out from Google's Chrome field data. And this is when you're using Lighthouse, etc. So the first contentful paint, like we were saying before, is measured at the moment when a browser has rendered any content from the DOM, right? The largest contentful paint is the measurement of the amount of time it takes to render the largest visual part of your web page. Cumulative layout shift is when the page actually moves, and it's measuring the degree to which the page is moving. In terms of those things that we mentioned, like where the page is loaded and then all of a sudden that button from the right is popped over to the center. And the first input delay is measuring essentially how long it's going to take when a user clicks on something or does some type of interaction for your site to actually respond. That doesn't necessarily have to be a click either. That can be scrolling, that can be anything. And with that too, it really highlights the importance of using lazy loading for any resources that aren't needed above the fold of the page. Like if you're trying to load a handful of extra things all at once that don't need to be viewed at once, that's going to be one of those causes for when you can't scroll down a page as fast as you want to. And that's something to consider, that, anytime that happens to you, think about how many users there are out there on your page that are having the same experience and how many times they're not converting now, whether that's making a sale or any type of transaction. So in here, this is where we get into some of the more fun stuff with the waterfall view report. And essentially what that does is you can see here, there's 28 steps that it's showing, and that's showing how the page loaded, showing all of the unique requests that took place. And then you can see those little boxes with the different colors there. Those are actually showing what type of file was in the request and how long it took for each of those requests. And what's really interesting about this too, when you're looking here, right, requests 5 and 6, the two orangey boxes at the top around the 1 second mark in the middle there. When you're looking at that, you have to wonder if it was possible for them to group those files together, because those are two JavaScript files that are functioning at the same time, and they're taking up the same amount of time. So you could have instead grouped those together potentially, without actually diving into the files. I don't know if they specifically would be compatible, but there is a likelihood that you could have combined those two together, and then you see the red boxes beneath them. Those are fonts. So you could have got those fonts loading in one sequence step faster, and fonts are usually going to be heavier than JavaScript, right? So you'd think that you would want that happening sooner in order to free up the other threads for loading your images and also the rich media MP4 content at the bottom. You'll notice too that there are some vertical lines on this chart. We're not going to get into all of them. However, you can see if you're looking at the key that the largest contentful paint, as well as when the layout shift takes place, are also included in this report, which is important stuff to see. You can also see that the navy blue horizontal line there is showing when the document was considered complete. So at that point, and you can see here that it went all the way down to about request 17. So that's basically saying that those first 17 requests were what was needed to bring the top of the page to life. And then as we scroll down, as the end user, we don't know it, but as you're doing that, they're lazy loading these two MP4 files, which are the teal ones that are a little longer, as well as some more JavaScript and also some images. Another great thing that you can see from this chart here is that whatever that image is in request 24 could be, it could be reduced dramatically. When you're looking at all the other purple boxes in there, those are taking less than 300 milliseconds, right? And this one's taking 730. So I would assume that there must be some optimization opportunity there. And then similarly too, without knowing what they're actually functioning as, it's difficult to say, but those last two requests in that sequence there, you're spending 2 seconds there loading JavaScript files. And it does make you wonder if grouping them together and minifying the code would be more effective if it was possible.
I think this slide is a very good visualization of how many requests we're actually looking at here, because we think as users, well, just load the website, just one thing. And I think it emphasizes the importance of what I would call decluttering, reducing, like you mentioned, minifying, but also looking at all the redundant code and JavaScript, etc., that are on there to try to keep that to a minimum. And I think I'll mention it towards the end as well. But I'm an offender. I put my hand up. There's too much stuff on our website there that I know are creating a lag.
And so one of the other things too that's going to come up in these reports, you'll notice down here these two pie charts. And what's really interesting about these is that they're basically summarizing everything you just saw in that waterfall view and showing what % of your requests came from what type of file type. So you can see this one has HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, fonts, video, and other. And then you can see how many bytes, though, of the actual transfers each one of those was taking in relation to the total page loading. I mean, obviously, it should be no surprise that a video is probably going to be the larger one on the page. But when we look at that and we see that, you know, the video had maybe less than 10% of all requests, but it's taking up 80% of the load payload, you know, you'd have to wonder if there is a compression opportunity in there, right? And then, you know, the second largest thing is the JavaScript. It looks like that actually might be pretty decently optimized when compared to the video, given that JavaScript is 41% of the total requests, which is what's being shown on the left. So you're always going to want to take a look at this as well whenever you're producing content or auditing content, because that's just ultimately giving you a sneak peek at what's actually going on under the hood of the site. Google also offers a page speeds insight tool, and what they do there is they give you more specific actual suggestions regarding the latency. I think that for someone who's getting started with this, start off using page speed insights and get the understanding for what the actual things they're suggesting are, but then also put the same URL in webpagetest.org and reverse engineer in your mind why it's functioning like that. And I think that having those two things going hand in hand really helps you learn what's going on here a lot faster than otherwise you might have. What's neat with this tool too is you don't have as much control in terms of the locations, etc., but you do get to test things for desktop and mobile, and they give you specific instructions based on either. You know, and like I was saying, it's a really nice sort of cheat sheet to have, and definitely something that you want to be starting off with, especially if this is new to you. So you can see here, they actually show what percentile you're in terms of how you rank compared to other sites. There used to be a way, there might still be, but there used to be a way you could actually even specialize this down to what your niche is, right? So in this case, PayPal would probably be interested to know what other financial institutions are rating like as well. I think that now this score that they give you is supposed to be tailored towards the broader web, but I do feel that there probably is some consideration taken too versus that sort of thing, like who you're competing with a little bit. But it's pretty nice to be able to have that information, and then having it, like I said, for both the desktop and the mobile is important because they're going to give you suggestions for both. And that's going to also bring up the importance of testing again, right? Like what they tell you to do with the mobile site might not be beneficial for your desktop, and it might ruin the experience. I've seen it happen with a handful of places I've worked over the years where people would change things, like especially when the mobile shift was really taking place. People were, you know, updating all these files and not realizing that all of a sudden, you know, they had goofy looking pictures on the desktop version, or the font wasn't what it was supposed to be because they just specifically focused on the mobile.
And I think a useful thing here is that this is not just for your own site. So while perhaps the benchmarking is not directly available there, well, make a list of your top 4 or so competitors and just keep the scores, and keep monitoring the scores and keep monitoring how you're performing against them, because you can put in any website there. So it's helpful from that point of view.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, this is something too that, you know, like I would think about maybe, you know, creating a list, right? Depending on the size of your site, but, you know, at least once a month, check what's going on with all these tools for your homepage. And then any pages that are important, whether or not it's because that's where your biggest conversion touch point is, and or it's the page that really directs people to your mission statement or something, depending on what type of site you have. But, you know, making sure that those high priority pages are always functioning as well as possible is really going to be the biggest part of your job, essentially, because at the end of the day, if you're responsible for making this good experience for the user, but the user is still not getting what they need, it is kind of, it becomes your problem, and you don't want to have that discussion with the manager or anything later on. We've already kind of gone over this stuff here. It's just the same field data, but you can see here it's just a little larger version of the image. So you can see that they're telling you what the timings are, and then also what the cumulative layout shift was. And you can see here, this isn't too bad. It could be a little faster, but it also apparently does not pass the Core Web Vitals assessment. Looking here, they also offer what they call lab data, and that's just giving a little bit more information. I think that the biggest things to be looking for here are the first contentful paint and the largest contentful paint. The other stuff maybe isn't quite as important. Like, you've already seen the cumulative layout shift in the section above it. The blocking time, it's something to consider, but I think more often than not, when you're looking at this report, making those changes that they recommend are going to help with that anyways. So I'm not too sure that I'd be focused too much on this. And then here is where I mentioned the cheat sheet, right? So essentially, they're going to give you what the opportunities are to increase things, and then also what the actual savings might be. And they'll tell you the individual files too, which is pretty interesting. So looking here, it says that there's render blocking resources, right? So we expand what's going on here, and we can see that there's this one file, it's a CSS file that took 47 kilobits to transfer, and you can save a full second from it, almost 1.03 they said. So that's something to be considering. And whether or not that actual savings is correct, it's still just good to know, right? And good to have that estimated version, because then when you're trying to make the case for resources internally, it's a lot easier to go in and say, hey, like, my page is taking 5 seconds. If I make this change and this change and this change, I can take 40% of that time off, 2 seconds. 40% increase in the time for this will not just improve our rankings, but we can probably assume that we will take X% of that bounce rate and exit rate down. And then at that point, you're looking at people that are more likely to convert. So if you do a little math, put together some information there, figure out what the value of the conversion is that's on that page, and all of a sudden you can model out how much money is potentially being lost. And whether or not your estimate is 1,000% correct, it's a lot easier to tell someone, hey, I need X amount of resources because we can make Y amount of money, versus just going in and saying, hey, it's important that we change this, but it's just important, right? So they'll also give you some more information on different diagnostic opportunities. And so these are something that you'll want to take a look at as well. And then, and you see in the green box at the bottom, they'll also tell you how many of their audits and things that they're looking for that you passed. And that's going to be important too, to know what you did well, because sometimes you might come across something you don't understand, but you can go and see that you did well with certain other items on there. And then from there, it might be something relevant, or at least point you in the right direction of what you have to do to make the optimization. So like we were saying, you want to combine the two of these tools anytime you can. I think it's easier for people to put in the page speed insights and get the specific recommendations, but then also to go and use the 3 different or 4 different network connections on webpagetest.org and actually see how that's impacting things across the variety of connection points. Because that's going to be something too that you're going to have to be thinking about when you're coming up with things like compressing images, etc. How then that's going to work, like coming across in these different connections. Are things going to be loading grainy? Is there going to be certain other problems with them? So it's going to be, definitely a good move to combine the 2 of them together. And at that point too, you're going to be able to go in and make that mathematical model that I was talking about, which is going to be a very easy way to win time with your dev team, right?
Yeah, these are just some of me. Again, I'm putting my hand up here. I am an offender. I do have a lot of issues that I'm guilty of. And the first that I'm going to pick up on is to really make use. I've already started making use, but to make use of those, especially the ones that Charles mentioned now, Webpage Test and Lighthouse, because really they're free. They're there to be used, and they offer some really good insight. Another thing that I'm going to do, and I mentioned how important it is to effectively declutter. I know a little bit of code, and I know enough to cause trouble. And that's the problem. If I was really good at coding, I would probably be much neater. Now, I like to dabble with it. And I add a little bit of code here, I add a little bit there, because you know what? This is a tracking code and this does that. And at the end of the day, you leave that there and it just causes delays at the end of the day because there's more. So you need to declutter, go through and remove the stuff that absolutely doesn't have to be there. And in addition to that, I mean, the queue jumping JavaScript, I call it queue jumping because quite often that goes and sort of takes priority in the requests. So one way I do this, or one way I'm guilty of doing this, is plugins. So we operate our website on WordPress, and those plugins, WordPress is like built on dangling really neat plugins in front of you, and they're so tantalizing. Here's a plugin that does this little thing, or here's a plugin that does another niche little thing, and you think, wow, I'd really like that feature. I'd really like that added. Or there might be something that you want to add to your website because it does a neat little funky thing. Well, that causes delays, and that's another thing that you really need. And I think both the pie charts that you showed, Charles, I know for our website, JavaScript, it's the main sort of in terms of bytes and number of requests as well, it's the main thing, and they are queue jumping, so make sure you keep an eye on that. A really simple one is the images, and Charles, you've mentioned that before as well, both in terms of what format to choose, and also just to make sure that you not compress it to the point where it impacts the quality of it, but you can compress nowadays without it visibly impacting that. And I think in terms of the format, I go by a very simple one. Charles mentioned next gen. That's something that I'm going to look into. For now, what I'm looking at is that if it's something simple, for instance, if there's a div or a button that uses our brand colors, make it PNG, because that's the simple thing it uses well. If there's something more complex, it's a beautiful picture or photo or something that you've gone there, fine, JPEG. Simple as that. And Charles also mentioned, the servers and the network. So we have a host for our website. We've decided to make use of a server that is closest to our target audiences. Little simple things like that. So those are the things that we're doing now, and some of these that I'm going to do coming up. That's just my main thing. But I think it's becoming such an important thing, web speed, because like I said, people are getting less and less impatient, and at the end of the day, it's you lose your audience, you lose what your audience and therefore in our case, we want our audience to submit inquiries that become business opportunities to customers. So people like Charles, who I see myself a little bit like a patient, and Charles is almost like the doctor. So people like Charles come in and make things, look at the little things that we might have missed, etc., that really can make an impact at the end of the day. Because you know what, we just keep adding stuff, we just keep doing things, building on our website, and it's easy to forget what that does in terms of speed and performance.
Absolutely. And that's something that, anytime that you are looking at, any type of thing you want to add to the site, always make sure you run some tests and see how that's impacting it. Sometimes, like when you're using these tests too, it's supposed to be on a live page. So maybe put it on a page that doesn't exactly count, make sure the page is no index, and then test it there before actually applying it to your live code, and then just take down the old URL. Because sometimes too, you can also find similar things and test them as well, but I'll get into that shortly. So, like Andy was saying, right, you want to make sure that, especially in the instance of your JavaScript and CSS, that anytime code can be minified, which is essentially when you take all of the blank space out, right? Anytime that can happen, without causing any impact on the actual performance or the output of what comes out, you definitely want to be taking advantage of that. And similar, like I said a couple times, grouping, certain times these files can actually be combined into one. Not every time, but you're going to have to take a look and see that first, right? But that's always going to be something that you want to do. Andy had mentioned too with the queue jumping JavaScript. So in those instances, we want to be using things like lazy loading. For those who aren't familiar, essentially what you do is you're just saying, hey, I don't need this item until the user essentially passes through this point in the page. So in the instance of that slide where we showed the waterfall view, they knew that the page needed to render before they tried to actually load that huge video file, right? Or the 2 video files actually. And in doing that, you're saving a lot of time, because otherwise the page wouldn't actually be considered functional until that video at the very bottom loaded. And as you saw, that took a lot of time to do, right? Like it took 1.6 seconds, I believe, for the initial render. And then for the actual final file to play, it took over 6 seconds, right? And with how long the file ran for, that was, I believe, a 10-second file. So, you got to think about those things too before you go into actually building anything out. Some things that we might not think about too. I mean, rich media, like I just mentioned, like MP4 formats, anything like that, images, audio content, etc. Those things people tend to think about, but images as well. But people really don't seem to remember that font files are actually pretty big in comparison to what they're actually doing. And so anytime that you're using a font, you want to make sure that those files are being compressed when they're transferring too. It's just something small that no one tends to think about, but more often than not, when you look at a well-optimized site, the font files are actually still some of the larger requests that are in there. We had touched upon it before too, that Google's accelerated mobile pages tried to fix a lot of these problems. One of the ways that they did that was the template files actually that you would use. The images were already pre-put in using iframes. And an iframe is essentially just a blank box that was where an image is going to go. And by doing that, no matter what the browser is, it doesn't have to calculate because it knows it just has to fill that frame. And so that was saving time, because otherwise when you pull up an image in a browser, more often than not, the traditional way of it going, depending on how it's optimized, is literally the browser itself is calculating the size of your window and then relaying that to the server when it pulls the information so it can adjust the size of the images to fit your screen or to fit the portion that they're supposed to. And in doing that, I mean, we know it can happen quickly, but we want it to happen as quickly as possible or avoid the mess altogether, like the AMPs are trying to do. The other thing with them too, just to give a little more history, since we're talking about the JavaScript and the CSS, what they did there was actually they created their own libraries for that. And so in doing so, they basically removed any type of fat, if you will, commands that weren't necessary. And in doing that, they made the pages have to load faster because you couldn't do things that they deemed wasting time. I'm sure, if you look at AMPs, they're a lot different than they were a handful of years ago, but it's certainly worth going and finding something, if you can, from an old AMP file, because it is interesting to see the way that they became much more interactive. They were kind of like Frankenstein pages when they first came out. They were very fast, but they just didn't quite look right. Like now they've changed things around a bit and it looks a lot more natural, but something to take a look at and consider. Like Andy was saying, the content management systems such as WordPress or Shopify or any of those guys, those are going to be an easy way to make your site work and to load content, to track inventory, etc. However, your page load speed is also going to be negatively impacted. These items are built heavily using templates, right? And template files, I think while the developers have the best intentions, they don't really care how fast your site goes. Like they just need it to go fast in general. So template files aren't necessarily going to be as optimized as possible. And on top of that, no matter what, depending on what theme you pick, you're going to have different network payloads just to load the resources. So that's why you're always going to want to be testing what these things are before you make a decision on what CMS to make. One of the great ways to do this, and find a website with that theme, right? So what you can do there is figure out what goes in the theme source code. And there are code repositories such as nerdydata.com, where you can actually take a snippet of code and put it in, And it's kind of like Google searching. Like it'll go and look through, thousands of source codes that it has on file, and you can get examples. And this is something I've done before when we were projecting things, like to pick a CMS, right? Figuring out, okay, well, this site is very similar to what we're going to do using the same theme, the same system. Whereas, like, I believe the one I was doing the most recently was a WordPress versus a Shopify. And in the instance of that, what was interesting was the WordPress site was actually a lot faster. The Shopify had it beat on the first bite, but I think that's because they use a wider, content distribution network. However, the WordPress site was a lot faster. Each time I looked at different examples, right? I probably looked at 10 each. But you want to be testing those things before you make a decision, because you might right off the bat be picking a format for your website that ultimately makes it too slow to compete with other sites that you want to be competing with. Like I was saying, there's a lot of templates and a lot of files that go into those templates. And so you do need to make sure that anything that you do install also is able to be optimized. I know that unless you have a bit of a coding background, it can be a little intimidating to hop into the editor section of WordPress. But going in there, you can make a lot of good changes within the actual files that load in the template. Like I said, I don't recommend doing that if you're not necessarily comfortable with code, but it is something that if you know someone who is, that they can go in and look at and make some of these small tweaks in order to make your theme be a little friendlier for you. And that's going to be an important thing just right off the bat. So, plugins also are something that can be pointed to in terms of making things too long to load, right? So if you're looking at like what the plugins falling in are, you'll notice that in that waterfall view, like plenty of those items are actually plugins functioning. But what's neat about plugins is that there are also plenty that can help you. I believe in WordPress, they have like the image smush, they have, they have lazy loading, different options for that. And those are things you're going to want to take advantage of. And for the most part, they're pretty good. Always test everything before you set it live. But for the most part, with minimal alterations, you can actually use those and they'll save you time. So the plugins here, they're kind of a blessing and a curse, depending on what you're trying to do with them. But, that's also the price you pay to get such a fully customizable site without having to have a professional developer. So that's always something to consider too, But always test anything before you set it live. That's always, it should never be anything you're not doing. So now getting onto the third-party cookies. And this is something I was actually discussing on another panel recently. A lot of people were starting to flip out that Google Chrome is no longer accepting third-party cookies. And, what's interesting there is, I get that they have like 70% market share of the desktop browsing and I think 25% of mobile. But people don't think about, like Safari and Firefox and all sorts of other ones already don't work with them, right? So it's not necessarily the end of the world, but it is going to force developers to go in and actually reassess how they're making their code. And because of this Chrome, when they're making this change in Chrome, I think that that's part of a way for them to slightly, A, push people towards using Google Tag Manager, which is one of their products, and B, they're also telling people essentially like, hey, like we noticed that you're wasting a lot of time with people with these, requests here. Either clean up the page or you're not going to render and rank well or get your information. I think that's going to pose some interesting challenges for the companies that run these third-party analytics sites, because they're going to have to figure out ways to make their tags tag manager friendly. And within that too, there is multiple ways that you can run multiple tag managers at once, right? Because some fit in different parts of the page than others. And then you can, of course, build your own custom one should you need to be grouping a lot of tags. So looking at this chart on the right here, this is a beautiful one. I think it's like a 250 total requests to load a page, right? And if we're looking really closely in here, a lot of these files are tracking tags, JavaScript, little pixels, and then you see those red ones in the middle there, those big red requests there, those are fonts loading. And you'll notice that they have 5 going there or 6 going there at once, which is, a lot of network payload. And to the extent that, you're looking at this, right, it's 78 or 76 entries here, and they're not even halfway to that blue vertical line, which is where the page is rendering. So that's really not a good first step when you're looking at this sort of thing. And so what we want to do here is, if this were a site that we were working with, we'd want to look and say, hey, like for instance, Hotjar is in the 80th spot. We know that Hotjar is third-party cookies, right? So why wouldn't we want that in a tag manager? And then if for whatever reason it can't be compatible with the Google Tag Manager or the Adobe Tag Manager that you're using, well, hey, how do we build our own, right? And put it in somewhere where this tag has to be to function. Because ultimately, that's one request, and it's one of many, though, when you're looking at how many requests are total in this. I mean, this is broken up into 3 pages, and the page doesn't even render until you get to the 3rd page worth that I made here on the right. One other thing, too, to point out on this that's going to be really important when you're looking at source codes and the waterfall view in particular, you'll notice that a handful of these lines are yellow. And anytime that's happening, it's because the resources are redirecting. And you don't want to have that happen. It's A, it's messy, and B, no matter how short the time is, when you have that going, you're tying up a thread. And every time that thread is being tied up, a lot of other things could have happened and could have gone well. So anytime you come across those, you want to look and say to yourself either A, like, is this resource important? Like, do I need it to function for the page to load? And if it's not, you can just remove the resource from your source code. And or B, if it is important, where is this going to now? And from there, figure out the new destination, which is also going to be in the bottom of this report. I didn't include that because it's very, very detailed. But you can go to the bottom of these webpage test org requests and actually see all of the specific details of each individual file request. So for instance, here, this first one on the left where there's the redirect, you can actually go down and it'll say, for item number 65 there, or 85, sorry, it'll actually show what happened there, what they looked up, and what the final destination URL was. And you want to take a look and see, okay, well, if that final destination URL is live, which it looks like it is in this instance, how do I put that in my source code instead of taking all this extra time and resources just to get redirected somewhere automatically? And while that might look kind of, strange for just one instance like that one, the first one, look at then a little further down the page where you have, groups of 3, groups of 2, groups of 4, all happening at once. And ultimately, A, like, is it that important that you want to waste all that time? And B, look at the requests that are taking place that are in between all those groups, right? They're very small tasks. And so when you look at how much time is being put by tying up those resources, you can actually take the time from all these and come up with and model how much percentage of time is going to be saved by getting those threads out of the way. And like I was saying before, that attribution modeling is going to be essential in anything you're doing, especially when you're trying to get resources competing within the company internally and trying to get people's attention, right? We always want to go and say, hey, listen, here's what we know. Here's what we think can happen with it. And should we get to this point, we can save X amount or generate X amount of money. And then have a couple, also like, here's our target, but then let's say we only get 3/4 of the way there. Here's that. And then here's 50%, right? Because then at that point too, you're showing multiple options and showing that even if, hey, we're not 100% right, because we can't, test how fast it would actually be removing those things. So we don't know how the threads would be regrouped. But we do know that looking at that, we can say, hey, even if we don't get everything we want, we're still making X amount of money that we weren't making last week. I think we all agree that, we want to make that money. That's about it from the slides. Andy, did you have anything to add?
No, other than just to go back and summarize. I see we've got a couple of questions here. I was just going to say before we get on to those, again, for me, what matters here, or what to consider, is to zoom out, stop and think what matters to what I see as the 2 categories of audiences: your human users and bots. And then within those, I would prioritize humans. A lot of what you do to satisfy the bots in terms of web performance and speed will also serve humans, and vice versa. Do we want to tackle, so there was a question here, from one of the attendees which factors are affecting the performance of a web page, which is kind of I mean, Charles, you can give the better answer, shall we say? But it's effectively what we've been talking about mostly. For me, in short, before I let you give the real answer, it's basically browser requests, how many and how efficiently your website serves them. But again, like I said, Charles, you give the real answer now.
Sure. So within that, I think it might have been directed more based on the time that the question came in when we were looking at the Lighthouse information, et cetera. And I think within that, you want to look at really how to fix all of these, right? Because ultimately, if one of them is good, it's a good chance the other ones are going to be good, right? And then ultimately blending all these things together is what's going to be the most important. Google is changing ranking factors all the time, right in front of our eyes. Like, you'll notice some days that you can be in a private window and make the same query and not get the same answer, but you're sitting at the same desk, same computer. And, in those times too, things change, right? So realistically, what you want to be doing is looking to optimize all of these things, right? All of these scores. We touched upon the time to first byte was absolutely a ranking factor, and I think it still will always be, because ultimately, when you think about server problems, right, those are going to be really easy to detect based on your time to first byte. So that one's going to be there. Obviously the cumulative layout shift, like we were discussing, because at that point you are kind of looking a bit deceptive with what's happening, and sometimes you're pushing the user to perform an action they didn't want to complete, right? Like Andy was saying, sometimes you go to click a button that was on the right, next thing you know, it's in the center, and you accidentally clicked an ad. So, those are things that they're going to be looking at. But I mean, ultimately, with anything with this too, right? Like I said at the very beginning, this is sort of like thinking about the horsepower that's in a new car or a new motorcycle or a new boat, right? You're going to be thinking about the more horsepower it has, the more you can do with it. Outside of the actual physics behind that, you're going to get a lot more speed, or you're going to be able to tow a lot more stuff, right? More torque. So you want to be really optimizing for everything and ultimately have the best experience possible. And like I was saying, like the easiest way to do that is ultimately to go in, take the page speed insights report, get the list of the specific things you have to do, and then take that waterfall view from webpagetest.org and actually visualize what's going into it. And then from there, go in and make your changes. And as you do that, keep records too of everything that you've done. Like I mentioned prior, when I'm doing page speed requests and tests, right, what I'll do is I'll do a benchmark one where I'll take the webpagetest.org, each of the different entries for desktop and then all the mobile connection options, and I'll put them in one. And then when I make a change, like for instance, I put some lazy loading onto a site recently. And then what I did was, after making that change, I went in, ran the same tests, and I copied and pasted all of the results from those boxes that we looked at a little while ago. And then also kept the URL, because like I said, those URLs you can go back to and it's still the same data. And so at that point I had, everything laid out that I needed. I was able to track what the percent change were for each of the file optimizations that I made, because I also did some things with image optimization and a couple other items that needed to be addressed. But each time I did something, I ran those tests again and saved the URLs so that I could always go back and show what the value added was. And then similarly, let's say that in one instance, there was something that, one of the images was not as good as it should have been anymore. And in looking at that, I was able to go back and say, okay, well, do you want to change the way that you save the image? Or, is it really not worth us having this, 20% that we just took off the top line of the page loading? And then at that point, we agreed upon that it had to be optimized further, the image itself, and that what we had done was still the right way to go. Just the sizing had to change. So, in short, just always be, looking to fix all of these items as much as possible, and to tie in the math behind it too, to show what the ROI will be. And as always, test anything before it actually goes live. And it looks like we have another question here that we can take live. How does page speed affect web user experience? So with that, it's ultimately everything. One of the things we're saying right off the bat is, Google considers it, when we're talking about the time to first byte, Google considers that when you ask a query, they're going to give you an answer, and that whatever answer they bring you, you should be able to click, and it should be fast enough that it's as if you asked Andy or I in person right now, right? And so when you think about that, the faster that a page can deliver the experience that the user wants, the more likely they are to interact with it. You know, people will get bored and leave your content. And or we were saying too, you know, some of these sites are going to have really long conversion funnels, right? And maybe you do want to have like 18 or, you know, maybe 18 touch points for whatever reason. Maybe you want people filling out contact forms. You want them to play a game. You want them then to scroll through a photo gallery. And if you're trying to get people to do a bunch of actions like that, you need to provide a fast experience. It's also more trustworthy too, right? Like when SSL certificates became big, that was something that people were like, oh, well, it doesn't have SSL, I don't trust it. And then after SSL really started getting implemented more, that's when people also kind of felt more safe with a faster page. So really, it just encourages people to interact with it better, I would say. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of user experience, hey, as humans, we're emotional beings, and you know, delays and slow speed, it frustrates us. So if we get frustrated when we're dealing with a website, it leaves a negative, it gives us a negative impression, not just of that website, but of the brand or the organization that you're dealing with. So the implications are wider and deeper than just that click or that little moment of that event and that request, if you will. So we may think of it, you know, what's waiting a few more seconds? Well, it does have an impact on you know, people's impressions and feelings and experiences with your brand and your organization. And at the end of the day, if they left, I think Charles referred to it before, well, they're not going to buy from you, are they? So if you are selling something through your website, or even if that's offering a way to get in touch to speak to someone to buy something, well, it's going to be less likely, isn't it, in that case? So in terms of user experience, it can have quite big implications.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any questions there?
Thank you, Anders and Charles. You know, that was a great session about you know, WPT. You know, a lot of insights on how to draft a report on the websites and how to optimize it for the user experience to get the page fast. So thank you very much, panelists, Anders and Charles. Thank you once again.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Take it easy.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.